Welcome to part 2 of my video series where I'm answering your questions about 1066 and the Norman Conquest. We're sticking with the Vikings and Stamford Bridge with our next question from Andy on WordPress, who asks, how many men did Harold have at Stamford Bridge and subsequently have at Hastings? How did casualties affect him? Thanks for the question, Andy. As far as is known, Harold had about between 8,000 and 10,000 men at Stamford Bridge. The Vikings had, for the record, a roughly similar number, but of course they were caught unprepared and was pretty much annihilated. They could only man 25 of their estimated 300 ships after the battle. Harold marched having partially disbanded his men again. He'd already disbanded them previous to the Battle of Stamford Bridge and had to re-raise them again, which is quite an incredible feat. And then he hung around for about 6 days in London after getting back south, a march which took him less time than the original march to Yorkshire. By the time of the Battle of Hastings, he is thought to have again recouped his numbers to about the level of no more than 9,000, and most people think about 7 to 8, which is roughly thought the size of the Norman army. So realistically, casualties didn't really affect him very much because he was able to replace the losses at Stamford Bridge, which were admittedly quite heavy at about 1,000 men. Okay, another question from Andy. We have, if Harold had lost the Battle of Stamford Bridge, would war have arisen between William and the Norwegian forces? I don't think there's any doubt in this matter that yes, they would have gone for each other because both were after the English throne, both were invaders, both faced ultimate destruction if they were defeated. And so they would certainly have gone towards each other with the main possibility of fighting one another. Certainly William wasn't going home without a crown, and though there is a possibility that they might have thrashed out some sort of deal, William might have paid off the Vikings, because he would do that later on with other Viking invasions, but I think we would be looking at more fighting. And so now we have from Sick Transit on Twitter at SickTransit34, and he asks, or they ask, I should say, why did Harold rush so quickly after his victory at Stamford Bridge to Hastings? It's a much debated point, very good question, and the answer is unclear, but we can cobble together several motives. First of all, the Normans were wrecking his earldom. After they landed, they started burning things. They had been restrained from burning things and pillaging things in their own country. And when they actually set foot in the combat zone, we'll call it, that gave them license to loot, pillage, destroy, and do all those nasty medieval things that armies tended to do back then. So he was very concerned about that. That made him look bad. That made him look weak. It made him look as if he couldn't take care of his people. So there's one pressing reason, and people think that William exploited this to draw Harold down. Also, the other reason why he probably moved so fast was because that was how he operated. In his campaigns in Wales, he used rapid marches, lightning strikes to destroy the enemy, to knock the fight out of him before the fight had begun. This is also obviously what he did at Stamford Bridge. He stole a march on the enemy and surprised the enemy in very fine style, and he was probably hoping to do the same to William. In fact, there are indications that he was hoping to ambush William, or at least catch him off guard by moving as fast as he could and hitting as hard as he could. That was Harold's basic campaign strategy: hit him hard and fast. Karls back now. Karl1066, if you want to follow him on Twitter. What happened to the English fleet? Nice simple question there, Karl. And happily, a fairly simple one to answer. The fleet was gathered on the same rough lines as the Fyrd. It was paid by special taxes by the kings of England, and it was dismissed in a similar manner. So when Harold dismissed the Fyrd, which is the English militia, pretty much, by the way, people, he also dismissed the fleet. Although they didn't quite go back to their homes, because the fleet was an integral part of Saxon strategy generally, the ships were sent up to London when, in September, Harold felt that it was too late in the season for William to get across safely. He did call them back when he heard that the Normans had arrived. He actually sent them to go back to the south coast and cut the Normans off from a retreat, which sort of would have hemmed them in between his position which he took up at Hastings and the south coast. But it also sort of highlights his strategy, which was a hard and fast blow, which would utterly annihilate them, and when they tried to escape, they wouldn't find their own ships anymore, they would find the Saxon fleet. Question from Brian Williams at BreeW74 on Twitter. Thanks for getting in touch, Brian. He's a good guy to follow on Twitter. Why did Harold put all of his heirs on the front line on the ridge, which is at Hastings? So to just clarify that, Harold's brothers were at the battle, Gurth and Leofwine, and they died with him there. But the secret that not a lot of people know about is that Harold had about 3 sons. And although it's not quite known whether they were at the battle, 1 or 2 of them might have been old enough to have participated. They escaped and would remain a great source of worry to William for pretty much the next 5 or more years after the conquest. So the answer is that he didn't actually put all of his heirs on the front line of the ridge. He certainly probably put his regents on the front line of the ridge. The reason he did that was simply because he had a lot of Fyrd men at the battle. He needed to keep them controlled. Also, Anglo-Saxon culture and tradition, and pretty much actually any practices as well, because the Normans believed in this sort of stuff as well, was that leaders fought with their men. That leaders could be seen with their men, surrounded by their best troops, fighting and hewing their way through the enemy like the mighty heroes they were. So basic strategic and cultural reasons was his motivation to put, or to allow, his brothers front rank positions. Also, I have a suspicion that because of the vast numbers of militiamen there, they probably easily outnumbered the amount of professional troops he had. He needed a strong front line of elite troops, his huscarls, his nobles, thanes, earls, stuff like that, in front of them to keep them on the ridge. Those, I think, are the principal reasons why the Saxon nobility were in the front line at Hastings, because it was their right, it was their duty, and it was strategically necessary for the integrity of the position, for them to hold the front of the shield wall. That's all for this episode, guys. Please subscribe to keep up to date with this series, and until then, here's a nervous chess man.